Now we're going to start to transition between micro and macro. One of the things that, at least very loosely, links micro and macro together is that there is a role for government in economic activity. We see this especially in in presidential election years when candidates talk about what they want to do for us and how they want to help the economy. The way government steps into the economy is different, though, in micro and macro. We'll talk much more about macroeconomic policies that have a potential impact on the overall activity in an economy as when we get into fiscal and monetary policy. But at the micro level, mainly what we're talking about are government activities that get in the way of markets and market activity. Sometimes we look at those government regulations, those government decisions, and we say, you know what, this is what we want government to do in the economy, or in just generally. These are roles that government has to play. Other times, we maybe look a little bit more askance at what government's doing, and perhaps think of it in the way that maybe government activity is done to favor a group of people, and it's going to hurt somebody else. Really what I want to pay attention to is not so much the politics here, although the politics can be very interesting, and economists do have a way of analyzing economic behavior through a political lens. It's something that's called public choice economics. But we're not going to focus so much on that. What I want to look at primarily are the impacts that government activity has on economic behavior when it does insert itself, whether it's for a noble reason or not. So we're going to look at the way, basically, the role that government plays in the economy, and then we're going to take a look at some specific instances of what are the consequences of government interfering with market activity. So to start this off, I think it's good for us to see what economists view the role of government to be overall. And to do that, we need to go back in time, way back in time, to the late 1700s, to hear from Adam Smith, the father of economics. We've mentioned him before. We want to hear what Adam Smith has to say about the role of government, because there is a role for government to play. And if government plays that role well, then it can actually be very beneficial for the economy. So let's take a look at the basics of what Adam Smith said the role of government should be. So once again, Adam Smith, in his great work, The Wealth of Nations, gives us a lot of detail about how economies should work and why some countries are richer than others. And one of the things he talks about in this book is what should government be doing when it comes to economic activity? What should government do to promote economic activity? And really, there aren't a whole lot of things that government needs to do to encourage economic growth, to encourage people to engage in transactions and engage in markets. In fact, of the things that Smith says government should do, two of them revolve around a single idea: the idea of protecting property rights. Property rights are the rights that someone has to do what they want with their property, whether it's to improve it, to sell it, to use it in a way to develop some new product that they can sell and make money. Property rights are really important because they go back to one of our basic economic fundamentals, the idea of incentives. Property rights provide incentives for people, and you can use your property to try to generate wealth. For instance, If you develop something, an idea or a product, and sell it and make money, that's good for you. You did the work and you deserve whatever financial rewards come as a result of that. So there are financial incentives from property rights. So if you provide something people want, you have the financial incentive, the positive financial incentive of earning profits. But on the other side, there's also the financial incentive of losses. So if people bear the burden of their bad decisions and reap the rewards from their good decisions, there are the profits on the one side. You made a good decision, you came up with a product people like, you developed an idea that people want, or you developed a really bad idea, nobody's really interested in this, then you can end up in the poorhouse. There it is, the poorhouse, and you are in it because you made bad decisions with your resources. It's a terrible looking poorhouse, but anyway, I think you get the idea here. You are now in the poorhouse. There you are. So, property rights provide incentives. And Smith says we need organizations. We're going to talk about institutions when we talk about economic growth in the macro portion of our course. But there are certain systems within a society that help to promote property rights. So Smith says one of the first roles, one of the most important roles of government if you want a government that's going to do something to encourage economic activity, you need to make sure that owners have control over their resources, and you need to protect their property. So this is number one, protect property rights from foreign invasion. So what that basically means is that one of the things governments need to do is have an army for defense. So here's a tank. This would be for defensive purposes at the very least, so that you can protect your citizens' resources and their property from somebody coming from another country. So let's say that Canada decides they want to invade the United States. It would be very bad military strategy, to say the least, for whoever's the president and whatever political party he or she belonged to say, you know what, you can attack certain states in our country because they don't agree with me politically, and we won't get in your way. That's just horrible political strategy. So no matter what political party is in power, no matter what the circumstances, it's the responsibility of a government to protect the resources of its citizens from foreign invasion, to protect property rights from foreign invasion. That's instrumental if government is going to have any credibility, if it's actually going to be a government that is going to foster economic well-being in its country, in the country, within the borders. It's got to protect resources and citizens and property rights from foreign invasion. The second thing that Smith said governments need to do is very similar, but instead of protecting resources from foreign invasion, it needs to protect it from domestic invasion. That means that it is the responsibility of the government to provide a fair and just justice system and police. So that no matter who you are, rich, poor, no matter what race you are, no matter what sex you are, you should be able to come to the court system and appeal to the police system to help protect your property rights. Of course, this is a big issue right now. The idea of social justice, the idea of fair application of the law. This is something that is, sadly, it's something that's questioned by people. And if you've paid any attention to what's going on, you've seen that when people don't believe that the justice system is fair, when people don't trust the police, there can be significant negative consequences to economic activity. This is why it's important that the system treat everyone fairly and equitably. Because if it doesn't, it can end up hurting everyone across the board. So just strictly from an economic perspective, it's a terrible idea to have a justice system and a police force that treat people unequally. So those are the first two things that Smith said governments should absolutely do. You need to protect people's property from foreign invasion, and secondly, from domestic invasion. Now we'll talk about the third thing that Smith said governments should be in the business of doing in a little bit. But for now, I want to focus our attention on these two ideas, just for a little bit of time, because there are some really interesting examples of what happens when people don't consider property rights, or when they try to take property rights away from individuals and give them to society as a whole. So here's a picture of a situation where somebody's property rights are not being protected. You know, the person, whoever lives in this house, is asking, please don't dump your garbage in my yard. And imagine what you would do if this was your yard. You would not take kindly to this either. It's your personal property. Somebody needs to protect it. And if it's not going to be the government protecting property, then citizens will take these kinds of things into their own hands, and it can get a little bit messy. Imagine what would happen in your neighborhood, for example, if people throughout the course of the night would come by and vandalize things. And you call the police and they don't do anything. Well, one of the responses might be for people in the neighborhood to get together and basically start using vigilante justice and perhaps sitting out on their porches with loaded weapons to try to keep the vandals away. Now that can get really, really dangerous. If the police won't come and take care of the problem like they're supposed to, and people start to take matters into their own hands, society can get a lot less stable. So this is one of the things that governments need to do. The problem is, or one of the problems occurs as far as society is concerned, one of the problems occurs when there are unclear property rights, when it's not clear who owns what. Now, for your car or your phone or even your textbooks, it's pretty clear who owns those things. You have paid for them. They become yours. You might even have a title to things like a car or a house, something that's filed at a courthouse somewhere that says this is legally your property. But there's a lot of times where things are not, where property rights are not clearly defined. And when that happens, people tend to misuse or use badly the property that's available to them. Maybe you've seen, if you've ever been in a city somewhere, you've seen racks of bikes available to people. You can swipe your credit card, you can use an app, and you can access this bike, and you have to pay a little bit of money, and you return it to another station somewhere else. I've seen these in Pittsburgh, of course. I've been to New York a lot, and it's kind of annoying. They have rows of bikes taking up parking spots now, so it's a little bit harder to park in New York City, and as if it wasn't hard enough to park in New York City. But these bikes are not anyone's property, really. It's not your property, but you have the ability to borrow the bicycle. One of the problems with borrowing bikes, though, is that sometimes people don't use the bike in a proper way, especially if there's no credit card attached to the bike. Here is a picture of a beautiful college campus in Barry, Georgia. It's called Barry College. And Barry College had a problem with property rights. A good friend of mine wrote an article about the Barry bike problem. The Berry College campus is a little bit spread out, and there were some times where students were having trouble getting from one class to another. So the student government thought it would be a great idea to raise some money and provide some, access to bikes for the students on campus at no charge, no additional charge anyway. So students started to take advantage of this program. Now, in the fall semester of when the program started, the student government began to realize there were some issues with the program. Of 20 bikes that started the program, 4 were missing and 11 were in an utter state of disrepair. So students went home for the summer. The student government paid to have the bikes repaired and sent letters out to the students asking them to please take care of the Berry bikes. This was a service that was being provided, and why would you want to cause a problem for fellow students? Why would you want this program to go away? Please take care of the Berry bikes. So the fall semester began, and very quickly bikes were broken, bikes were lost, and about 4 weeks into the semester, the Berry bike program was utterly abandoned. It seemed that the student government, in their entirely well-meaning attempt to provide bicycles to students, fell prey to one of the more common problems in economics. It's called the public goods problem. Here's a more modern version of this problem of failure to identify property rights. I was in Washington, D.C. running along a trail and found this scooter just laying on the side of the trail. And I've seen these scooters just laying around in other cities around the country as well. These are scooters that you can rent, and supposedly you can just drop them wherever you want to drop them, and somebody else can come along and use them via an app as well. The problem is that along this trail, it's very hard to find this scooter, as it is dirty and muddy and just kind of mixed in with the brush and the detritus of the trail. It may not be used by anyone because it's hard to access, and somebody just dumped it along the trail. Because it's not anyone's property, it's clearly not being taken care of very well, and it's not being used well by the people who would like to make money off of this scooter, because the property rights themselves are really rather unclear. And that's what I want to talk about here. What happens when there is a failure to clearly identify property rights? Adam Smith said you need to have government protect property rights, but what if it's hard to tell who owns what? Well, we have a very special case for those kinds of situations, a very special term for those kinds of situations. It's referred to as a public good. But I think to understand what a public good is, it would help us to first of all very clearly understand what a private good is. So let's think about private goods, something that somebody very clearly owns, and tie it back into that idea of incentives that I mentioned a little bit earlier. If we're talking about something like a car, with private property, there is a clear incentive to maintain the car. You change the oil, you might wash the car regularly, you put gas in the car, you take it for inspection, because if the car stops working, it loses value to you. There's clearly an incentive to maintain cars. You want to protect it from theft. So you lock the doors. You might have an anti-theft system. You put it in the garage at night. It's your vehicle. You want to protect it from theft and damage as well. So you don't go running the car into a telephone pole or into other cars. You try to avoid hitting potholes at 80 miles an hour. You want to protect it. It's your property, and you bear the burden if you don't protect it. You bear the burden if you don't maintain the car. You want to conserve it to some extent to extend its life. So as a result of that, perhaps you don't rev the engine up to 8,000 RPM every time you get a chance. You might do it occasionally, but not every time you need to merge into traffic. You try to protect it. You try to take care of it. And you also have the rights and the ability to trade that car to other people. So if so, I have a truck that I've had for a long time. It's older than my children. And I've had some people make the offer to buy it from me, and I can do that if I want, if the value of the vehicle is no longer high enough for me. But it's my choice. It's my property. I can trade it with other people, and I want to protect it so that if I do want to trade it, then it has some, I can get some extra money for it. Now, contrast this with, say, a rental car. Rental cars are cars that are not yours, and you have a tendency, at least I do when I rent a car, to rev the RPMs up really high, to mash the gas when I have to merge. I can't trade it with somebody else. It's not my car, but I don't pay particular attention to where I park it. I'm not as worried about any damage happening to the car. So I may drive a little more recklessly with a rental car because it's not my car and I don't have the incentive to maintain it. So I never bring the car back washed. I don't check, I don't have the brakes replaced. I run up to the yellow lights, and if I have to jam on the brakes, I do that because it's a rental car. It's not my property. Private goods are goods that are yours, and so you have an incentive to act differently with them than you do if the good isn't yours. So let's contrast that with a public good. So at this point, we've talked about markets as being very effective things to help distribute goods and services and to help to increase the value that's generated through trade. But sometimes society looks at markets and the outcomes that markets generate. And society kind of shakes its collective head and says, you know what, we don't like that outcome. We view the outcome as not optimal, even if it's demand and supply intersecting, and that's great. We look at the outcome of the market and say, you know what, something's wrong here. There's a failure in the market. And we've already talked about one form of market failure, but now we're going to talk about a couple of others. And from an economic point of view, when there are market failures, or when there are deemed to be, from society's perspective, market failures, there might actually be a legitimate role for government to step into the market and try to fix some things. So let's explore market failures with the understanding that sometimes market failures are in the eye of the beholder. Just because one person deems an outcome to be a market failure doesn't mean that everybody else does. So let's examine market failures. Let's take a look at a list of market failures first and then start to break those things down and try to understand them better. The first market failure that we have seen in our class was monopoly. Remember, monopoly generated an outcome where the prices were higher and the output was lower than what society really wanted. That's an example of a market failure. But there are other market failures. One comes through what we call the provision of public goods. I'll explain what public goods are here shortly, but usually when there are public goods, or when goods are considered to be public, there's an underproduction of them. And we'll talk about why here in a minute. Another issue that comes up when we talk about market failure is when there is what's called a commons problem. And so we'll talk about that shortly. And then finally, we'll spend a good deal of time looking at externalities. Depending on the kind of externality we're dealing with, the market failure could be that there's not enough of something produced, or it could be that there's too much of something produced from society's perspective. So we've talked about what you can do with a private good, or basically the incentives behind private goods. Private goods are things that you own, and so you can control them. You can sell them if you want. You can hold on to them if you want. In fact, one of the more interesting approaches to environmental protection that I've ever heard involves buying up property so You can prevent it from being logged. If you own property and somebody wants to log it, you can just say, no, you're not allowed to do this. So there are characteristics of private goods as well. One of them is that you can exclude people from using your property if you want to. I mean, think about it. If somebody wants to hunt on your property or log on your property, you can say yes or no. It's your right. It's your property. Another thing is that private property typically, or private goods at least, are typically goods that cannot be consumed by more than one person, or at least they can't be consumed ad infinitum without somebody losing value. Think about a hamburger or a pizza. If you buy the pizza, it essentially becomes your property. And so when you consume it, it cannot be consumed by anybody else. That's just not the way it works. Similarly with clothing or a house. There's only so many people you can put into a house before it just gets too crowded. So you can exclude people from using it. And there's only so many people who can use a particular item. Sometimes it's only one in the case of food. Sometimes it's some number of people in the case of a house. But there's a limit before people start to kind of get in each other's way. When we talk about public goods, though, those characteristics are flipped around, and that distinguishes a public good from a private good. The characteristics of a public good are that they are non-excludable. Non-excludability means that even if somebody doesn't pay for the good, they can still use it. They still have access to it. That would, of course, mean that if you are producing public goods or goods that are considered to be public in nature, your ability to earn profit is going to be significantly limited. If you can't force people to pay for a good that you've produced, it's going to be nearly impossible to cover your costs. I mean, think about McDonald's. What happens at a McDonald's when you go in? Well, here you are. We'll put the McDonald's. Here we are. Golden Arches. So here's McDonald's. Billions and billions of people served. And you go into the McDonald's and you say, give me a hamburger. And so the worker behind the counter makes the hamburger or calls back to the person in the kitchen. They ring the cash register. They ask you to pay before you get the hamburger. So you've got to hand over money to the cashier before they give you the hamburger. So here it comes. Here's your bag of McDonald's food. And you walk out and you have your Big Mac or your McNuggets or whatever, and everything's fine. This is a private good. We know it's a private good because McDonald's can tell you, if you don't pay, we're not giving you the hamburger. But there are other kinds of goods, public goods, where if you don't pay for the good, it doesn't matter. You can still use it. Now that may seem odd, but the second characteristic of a public good is that it's non-rival in consumption. It's non-rival in consumption, which means more than one person can use the good and use it enjoyably. So if I use the good and you use the good and your Aunt Tilly uses the good in somewhere in Florida and your third cousin twice removed uses the good in California, it's not affecting any of our enjoyments of the good. Many, 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 many people can use a good, and we don't get in each other's way. Again, think about McDonald's food. So you've bought the McDonald's hamburger, and there are, I don't know how many people in line behind you, and you're going to eat that food. Even if you were to share it with the people in line behind you, there would be a point at which somebody says, I haven't gotten enough, I want yours. Or you might say, hey, give me that back, I'm hungrier than you are. The problem is that if somebody, say the second person in line, eats the food then it's not good for you anymore. So you eat the fries, they eat the nuggets, the third person eats the Big Mac. The food's gone. The food's not usable anymore. But with a public good, that's not the case. So what we see here is that McDonald's can charge you. That means that McDonald's food is excludable. And because if this person eats some of your food, or you eat the last Big Mac that McDonald's has made, it means that the food is rival in consumption. Once one person uses it, it's not good for anybody else. But with public goods, we don't have those characteristics. The characteristics are the reverse. Public goods are non-excludable and non-rival in consumption. So businesses can't force people to pay, and lots of people can use the good at the same time. This seems like a recipe for failure for a business. An example of a public good would be fireworks. So if I don't pay to see a fireworks show, that's fine. I can just get out of my car and see it anyway, because the nature of a fireworks show is that it's not contained to a small audience. It can't be contained to a small audience. Not a good fireworks show anyway. And it's non-rival in consumption, meaning many people can consume the fireworks show and still enjoy it. In fact, their enjoyment isn't any less because 300 people are watching the fireworks show, or 500 people, or 5,000 people. A public good is non-excludable and non-rival in consumption. The classic case of a public good is national defense. I mean, fireworks are a good example, but national defense is the example that most people fall back on when they talk about public goods. Think about this. There are people in this country who do not pay taxes. In fact, they get government services without paying for them. In fact, some people believe that national defense is a bad thing. Any kind of violence is a bad thing. So perhaps it would be a good idea if somebody wanted to invade our country to allow the military of that invading country to take over those particular people. And of course, I am talking about the Amish. So there are Amish in eastern Ohio who refuse to pay taxes. They don't refuse to pay taxes, but they're exempt from paying taxes, at least some kinds of taxes. And so those Amish driving their horse and buggies, so here they are driving the horse and buggy. Here's the horse. Yes, it's a terrible horse. I know, but you get the idea. They're riding their horse and buggies. They're getting in the way of traffic. They're not paying taxes. Maybe we should just allow foreign entities to take over eastern Ohio. That's, again, bad military strategy, but it would get rid of a problem. Well, except maybe the Amish aren't really that big of a problem. There aren't really that many of them. So, you know what? Even though they're not paying taxes, we're going to provide the service for them anyway. Basically, national defense is non-excludable if you want to have it. If somebody doesn't pay for it, it's foolish to allow harm to come to them from some invading body. Similarly, national defense is non-rival in consumption. I'm enjoying it right now, and so are you. And so are any of the people in the United States listening to this talk. And so are people, my former roommate from college in Montana, my cousin in Seattle who sort of hates the military-industrial complex. They're still benefiting from this. It's non-rival in consumption. Just because I'm enjoying it doesn't mean somebody's enjoying it any less. National defense is a public good. It's probably the most clear-cut case of a public good. We want national defense. We may want varying degrees of it, but we still want it. And we really, from an economic point of view, we want national defense because it helps to protect property rights. A final example of a public good would be National Public Radio. And This is one of those um, entities that really, really understands public goods. So oftentimes when I drive into campus, I listen to public radio. Give me some news, give me some information about what's going on in the world. But every so often they stop the programming and have a fundraising campaign. And it's at this point where I usually change the station and wait for the fundraising campaign to be over, because NPR depends upon raising funds. They don't advertise on the program, so they raise funds from listeners. And the people who are running the campaigns the fundraising campaigns inevitably try to guilt the listeners into making a contribution. They say something to the effect of, "You're benefiting from this, and you should pay your fair share. It's important that you do this so that you can continue to enjoy the radio and the fine programming on this station that you've come to enjoy. And because you've enjoyed it for so long, you need to contribute. It's your responsibility. Otherwise, this could go off the air." Now, part of that's true. But the problem for NPR is that they're providing a public good. They're providing a good that's non-excludable. Because if I don't pay, then some radio personality or Elmo is not going to jump through my radio and throttle me while I'm driving my car. If I don't pay, they can't keep me from using it. It's non-excludable. And similarly, it's non-rival in consumption, because I can listen to the NPR, you can listen to NPR, some little old lady in Squirrel Hill can listen to NPR. People can listen to the same radio station, and the volume doesn't diminish as more people log on. It's not like bandwidth. There's no diminution of the quality of the broadcast with more people listening to the radio station. So while the folks who are trying to get my money to help fund NPR are using the guilt trip, I just wait for them to go away, because I know it's a public good. And if it goes away, it's going to go away for everybody. And there's no reason for me to contribute, because it is a public good. This leads to the last thing I want to say about public goods, which involves something called the free rider problem. Whenever you have a public good, you have the potential for a free rider problem. A free rider problem occurs, and maybe you've seen this, maybe you've been the free rider before, where someone who wants something doesn't pay, but doesn't have to pay for it, gets the good anyway. You don't have to pay for it, so you don't pay for it. You just kind of free ride. You just follow along. You consume a good based on the generosity of other people. Someone who wants something but doesn't have to pay for it, gets the good anyway, they're considered a free rider. Maybe you've seen this with group work, where somebody free rides on the hard work of other people. Maybe you see this when somebody pays for a couple of large pizzas, and there's some left over, and so you eat some without having to pay for it. Maybe you've listened to NPR without contributing to the fund drive. That's a free rider. And whenever you have public goods, you have the potential for a free rider problem. And that brings us back to the role of government. So we've talked about the role of government in the context of private property, but we've also talked about the role of government in the attempt to address market failures. Whenever you have public goods, there's a tendency to underproduce a public good, because you can't make money at it. You can't force people to pay. So if people really do want public goods, and they're free riding off of the provision of public goods, it might be the case that government steps in to provide the public good, something that people actually want, but there's no real good market mechanism to enforce payment. That might be a legitimate role of government. And we actually see this in Adam Smith. To wrap up what Adam Smith said government should do, we have protection of private property through an army, protection of private property through a just and fair court system and police system. And finally, Smith said there are some things that governments should provide, some public goods. So that's our third point, that Smith says we need to protect property, and he gives us two ways to do that. And he says that governments should provide some public goods. In particular, Smith says that governments should provide education, and governments should provide resources that will help to promote truck and barter, which is just Smith's way of saying government should do things, should provide goods and services that help to promote trade. So whether it's roads or bridges, probably he would have, if he'd ever seen a plane, he would have said airports might be something that governments should do here. Governments should help to facilitate trade, not to do it, not to choose winners and losers, not to decide who gets to do the provision, but provide ways to get goods and services to people more easily. So Smith had some very specific roles for government. And most economists would look at that list and say, you know what, yes, yes, and yes. Those things make sense. Those are, at least at the very bare bones, things that governments should do in an economy. They should protect property from foreign invasion and from domestic problems as well. And there are certain public goods that governments should be in the business of providing. The question, though, is whether or not the things that governments provide are truly pure public goods. In other words, do they have those two main characteristics of being a public good? Or are they what we call a quasi-public good? A quasi-public good is a good that maybe has one of the two characteristics. Maybe it has none of the two characteristics, but it certainly doesn't have both. Nevertheless, government provides it because people think governments should provide this kind of thing. So this is provided by government, but doesn't have the two public good characteristics. So maybe it's excludable, but not non-rival. Maybe it is non-rival, but not excludable, and maybe it's neither. So for instance, think about a baseball game, a baseball stadium, or a football stadium. Sports stadiums are built by governments but really, they are not non-excludable. Try to sneak into a Steeler game and see what that looks like. Sports stadiums are excludable. And to an extent, they're rival in consumption. At some point, there's too many people in the stadium, and maybe you have to stand up the whole game, or maybe it's just the traffic becomes a nightmare. Sports stadiums are excludable, and definitely to an extent, they are rival in consumption. Or think about even education. Is education a pure public good? If it is, it's got to have both of those two characteristics, and it clearly doesn't. Is education excludable? Can you keep people from using it? Well, higher education you can if you don't pay for it. Public schools, you can keep people from using this. We suspend kids all the time. And we expel kids, not all the time, but often enough to say, yeah, there are ways we can keep people from using this item, even if they don't pay for it. And most people do pay for it, but if you don't pay your property taxes, that doesn't mean that your kid doesn't have to go to school. There are ways that people use these products even without paying for it. But then we can kick you out if you're bad. So even if you do pay for it, maybe we keep you out. So education isn't necessarily is certainly excludable. It's also rival in consumption. There is a point at which there are too many kids in the classroom. Sometimes you hear about overcrowded classrooms where kids have to sit on the floor or where kids have to share a desk. There's just too many kids in the room. In that case, the kids get in each other's way. They maybe interfere with somebody who really wants to learn's ability to learn. They clearly are rival in consumption. And with COVID, we see that this issue of being rival in consumption is going to probably exacerbate itself if you have to socially distance kids and limit how much access they have to the classroom. Education is clearly not a public good, but nevertheless, we see that governments provide education. And there's probably a good reason for that. We'll talk about one of those reasons a little bit later. What I want to do now, though, is to talk about a very specific quasi-public good issue, something called the commons problem. A commons problem exists when a resource is non-excludable, but it's rival in consumption. In other words, when people cannot be kept from using a good, even if they don't pay for it, but as people use that good up, it is diminished for other people. Fishing waters are non-excludable. You can't keep people from using them. I mean, you can. I guess you could go blow up people's boats, but that really isn't. That's kind of an extrajudicial way of making things excludable. The fish themselves are non-excludable. You can't keep people from catching them. But the more fish you catch, the more problematic it could be for restocking the fish supplies. This is what we mean by a commons problem. The common area in this example would be the ocean. And the fish are a resource that come out of that ocean. If a resource, and this is almost always with a resource, if a resource is non-excludable but rival in consumption, we say we have a commons problem, and we might have a role for government to step in and fix this particular problem, especially if the participants, the fishermen in this case, can't figure out a way to come to a solution on their own. If you haven't listened to the Billy Joel song that I have posted in the Music for Econ category, I would strongly recommend that you listen to that because it provides an outstanding illustration of the commons problem, where he has to go to actually catch fish. He has to sail more and more and more miles from shore every year because all of the fishing grounds around Long Island have been overfished. This is what we call the tragedy of the commons. So the tragedy of the commons comes from an idea that was presented by a guy named Garrett Hardin when he talked about herding and bringing herds to a common field, a field that nobody owned, and therein lies the problem. When nobody owned the common property, there was no incentive to protect it. So shepherds would bring their herds to the commons. They would basically, the sheep and the animals would graze. They would graze the grass down to dust, and then the herds would move on. And no one had an incentive to protect that pasture land because nobody owned it. Similarly, nobody has an incentive to protect the oceans because nobody owns it. So we see overfishing and we see people dumping garbage in the ocean. Remember that slide a little bit earlier where it said, please don't dump your trash in my yard? Well, if that trash kept being dumped in that person's yard, they would take action. But if people keep dumping trash in the ocean, now there are some environmental groups that oppose this, but there's no huge incentive for people to go out and try to protect the oceans and find the polluters because nobody owns the oceans and they're going to be overused. Whenever property is commonly owned, when it's owned by the town or society or by no one really, we almost always see those resources be negatively affected. It's not that there's anything wrong with having common property per se. It's just that if you do have common property, you have to understand that there's very little incentive to protect it. Think about where you see the most litter along a highway, where the signs posted say, "Do not litter or there will be a fine." Well, that's common property. It's usually the median strip of a highway or right along the side of the road. If you don't know who owns property, you might see tires dumped down over a hillside. Whose property is that? I don't know. And nobody has an incentive to protect that property. And it gets overused, it gets misused. That's the tragedy of the commons. And we might see a role for government to play to step in to try to fix that. Or maybe we won't. There are different ways to deal with the commons problem. In fact, the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in Economics, Elinor Ostrom, spent her time and her research evaluating the commons problem and trying to understand more about it. And one of the things she found was that societies around the world have commons. Commons are actually relatively common areas. But societies deal with them in very, very different ways. One of the things she found, one of the hallmarks of her research, was that people who live in societies where there is traditionally a communal attitude toward well-being tended to have far fewer commons problems because they all realized this issue. If we overfish an area or we overgraze an area, that's not just a problem for one person, that's a problem for everybody. And we look at the well-being of everybody as important. Where societies were more individualistic, then commons problems tended to be more profound or tend to be more extensive. So commons problems exist. And the question is, do we need government to step in and fix the problem? So should government step in and say, fishermen, you can only catch this amount of fish every year? That would be a regulation on the fishermen. Or can we trust the fishermen to actually behave and not overcatch because we need those fish to replenish the stock? That's the question. That's the commons problem. So when we look at market failures, we saw monopoly, we've dealt with that one already. Market failures can exist when there are public goods because there's no incentive to really provide the good because you can't make any money at it. And there might be a role for government to step in and provide goods that are public goods by nature because society really wants them and private businesses aren't going to produce them. And thirdly, we have the commons problem. The commons problem where because there are no clear property rights, then an item or a resource might get overused. And because it gets overused, it might be in the interest of society as a whole for government to step in and manage that resource. Whether it's the oceans, whether it's a common grazing area, or whether it's a national park. Governments might be best equipped to step in and protect those resources. The last item that I want to talk about in terms of market failure is what we call an externality. Externalities are a different kind of beast, though. So we're going to take a break here, and we'll come back and talk more about externalities next time.